The German aces laughed at the P-51 Mustang. They called it a mediocre performer, nothing to worry about. Then on March the 6th, 1944, 209 of them appeared over Berlin, and the laughter stopped forever. This isn't just a story about one remarkable airplane. It's a story about a deadly fundamental problem that was costing thousands of American lives and threatening to derail the entire Allied war strategy. In late 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force, based in the damp fields of England, was being bled white over the skies of Germany. They were committed to a new, largely unproven theory of war, daylight strategic bombing. The idea, championed by men who were called the Bomber Mafia, was that you could win a war not just by defeating armies in the field, but by breaking a nation's will and ability to fight. The plan was to fly deep into the heart of the Reich, in broad daylight, using the famous Norden bomb site to precisely destroy the factories that built Germany's tanks, planes, and ball bearings. But this entire strategy was failing, and it was failing catastrophically. The reason was something the bomber crews themselves came to call the gap of death. The workhorses of the 8th Air Force, the B-17, Flying Fortress, and the B-24 Liberator were magnificent machines. Many of you know them well. They were tough, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns and flown by crews of brave young men. The theory was that these flying fortresses could defend themselves by flying in tight combat boxes, creating an interlocking field of fire. However, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had perfected its defenses. They were fighting over their own homes, and they were experts. They knew our bombers were coming, and they waited. You see, our bombers did have fighter escorts, but those escorts were, as the pilots said, short-legged. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast, tough as nails and a brilliant fighter. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was fast, with twin engines that gave pilots a sense of security, but both were thirsty machines. They were designed for a different kind of war, a tactical war, over the battlefields of France. They simply did not have the fuel to fly all the way to targets deep inside Germany. They could only protect the bombers for the first few hundred miles. Then their fuel gauges would hit the red. The fighter pilots had to make the terrible choice to peel off and head for home, leaving the bombers alone and defenseless for the most dangerous part of the mission. Can you imagine the feeling in that B-17 cockpit? You're 5 miles up, the air is -40 degrees, and you watch your little friends, your escorts, wag their wings and dive away. You know that for the next hour or more, you are on your own. And the Germans knew it too. This gap of death was a calculated kill zone. The German Jagdwaffe, their fighter wings, would gather their forces in wait. As soon as the escorts left, they would pounce. They attacked in waves, sometimes 100 at a time, flying through bomber formations in head-on attacks, cannons blazing. They tore the American formations to ribbons. The loss rates were simply staggering. During what became known as Black Week, in October 1943, the raids on Schweinfurt to destroy the ball-bearing plants were a disaster. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. That's 600 men gone. A 25-mission tour. The ticket home for a bomber crew became a statistical impossibility. The hard, cold math showed that you would not survive. Morale was shattered. The air war was being lost, not for a lack of courage, but for a devastating lack of range. This created a problem that military planners and engineers had insisted was impossible to solve. A fighter, by its very definition, had to be light, fast, and nimble to dogfight a Bf-109, but to fly for 1,000 miles, it had to be heavy, weighed down with massive amounts of fuel. It was an engineering paradox. You couldn't have both. And as 1943 came to a close, the solution was nowhere in sight. The one plane that could have been the answer, the North American P-51 Mustang, was sitting in hangars in North Africa, dismissed by almost everyone as a failure. So where was the Mustang in 1943? If you had mentioned the P-51 to a Luftwaffe ace, he likely would have dismissed it, if he'd even heard of it. If you'd mentioned it to a weary American bomber pilot, he'd have given you a blank stare. The plane existed, but it was a phantom in the one place it was needed most. It was an aircraft, floating in the margins of the war, a footnote, certainly not a war winner. The reason for this goes back to its very beginning. The P-51 wasn't even built for the U.S. Army. It was born from a desperate British request. In 1940, the Royal Air Force was fighting for its life, and it needed fighters, any fighters, and it needed them fast. They approached North American Aviation, a company known more for trainers than for high-performance fighters. The British asked them to build the P-40 Warhawk under license. The head of North American, a brilliant and famously gruff engineer named Dutch Kindleberger, looked at the P-40 design and in so many words said, "We can do better." He made an audacious promise. His team would design and build a brand new, better prototype in just 120 days. It was a timeline considered impossible. They did it in 102. The result was the new NA-73X, the prototype that would become the Mustang. It was a revolutionary airframe. Its most important feature was a laminar flow wing, a new design that cut through the air with incredibly low drag. It was sleek, fast, and handled like a dream at low altitudes. The British were impressed and named it the Mustang. This first version, the P-51A, had a fundamental, almost fatal flaw. That flaw was its heart, the Allison V1710 engine. Now we should be clear, the Allison was a solid, reliable American engine. It was a workhorse, the same engine that powered the P-40 Warhawk of the famous Flying Tigers and the early P-38 Lightnings. And at low altitudes, it performed beautifully. It was a world-class engine below 15,000 feet. The strategic air war over Germany, however, was not being fought at 15,000 feet. It was being fought at 25,000, even 30,000 feet, in the thin, frozen air where the B-17s flew. And up there, the Allison engine simply couldn't breathe. Its power was choked off by its supercharger, the device that forces air into the engine. The Allison had a single-stage supercharger, which was perfectly fine near the ground. But at high altitude, it was like trying to run a marathon while breathing through a straw. The plane became a dog. It was sluggish, underpowered, and tragically slow. A German Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 190, both designed specifically for high-altitude interception, could fly circles around it. A Luftwaffe ace encountering a P-51 at 25,000 feet wouldn't even consider it a threat. He would simply climb above it, where the Mustang couldn't follow, and then pounce at his leisure. Because of this, the P-51A was completely useless as a high-altitude bomber escort. It was a disappointment. The U.S. Army Air Forces had no interest in it. For the main event, the decisive air battle over Europe. So where did these failed planes go? They were relegated to the sideshows of the war. Many were sent to the China, Burma, India theater, where combat often happened at lower altitudes. The Army even ordered a dedicated ground attack version, the A-36 Apache. They fitted it with dive brakes, bomb racks, and 650 caliber machine guns. It became a mud mover, supporting troops on the ground, dive bombing German positions in North Africa and Sicily. And it was a good plane for that job. Pilots in the Mediterranean loved its speed on the deck and its ruggedness, but it was not the high-altitude savior the bomber crews were praying for. As far as the war over Germany was concerned, the Mustang was a dead end. The plane that looked like a thoroughbred was performing like a plow horse, and the gap of death remained wide open. But a few sharp-eyed engineers, one in particular, had a different idea. They believed the problem wasn't the plane, it was the engine. So the problem remained. 1943 was a brutal, bloody year. The 8th Air Force was on the verge of breaking the entire daylight bombing campaign. The linchpin of the American strategy in Europe was close to being called off. Something had to give, or the war in the air would be lost. The solution, as it turned out, wouldn't come from an American design bureau. It came from across the Atlantic, from a quiet experiment in Britain. The British, of course, had their own legendary fighter, the Supermarine Spitfire, and the heart of the Spitfire was a true masterpiece of engineering. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin, unlike the American Allison, was designed from the wheels up for high-altitude combat. Its secret was a revolutionary two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Think of it as a transmission for the engine's lungs. As the Spitfire climbed into the thin, frozen air, the supercharger would shift into a higher gear, continuing to force-feed the engine with the oxygen it needed to make power. The Allison, with its single-stage blower, would be gasping for breath, but the Merlin would be breathing just fine. It was without question the world's finest high-altitude piston engine. The idea that changed. The war was a simple what-if. A British test pilot named Ronnie Harker was given a chance to fly one of the early Allison-powered Mustangs. He was deeply impressed by the aircraft itself, its sleek lines, its advanced low-drag wing, its excellent handling. But like every other high-altitude pilot, he was appalled by the engine's performance. Once he climbed above 15,000 feet, he famously wrote a memo to his superiors with a simple, brilliant suggestion: put a Merlin engine in that American airframe. It was a long shot, a massive gamble. This wasn't like swapping a small block V8 in your garage. This was a transatlantic mechanical nightmare. The two engines were different sizes. They had differently shaped blocks. They required completely different engine mounts. And most critically, they had entirely different cooling systems. The Merlin, with its complex supercharger, ran hotter and needed more radiators. The engineers at Rolls-Royce and North American had to effectively re-engineer the entire front half of the plane. It was a huge risk. They could have easily created a Frankenstein's monster of an aircraft, heavy, unbalanced, and even worse than the original. But in late 1942, they went ahead. They took 5 P-51As, ripped out the Allisons, and somehow managed to shoehorn in the new Merlin 60 series engines. These prototypes were designated the XP-51B. The moment the test pilots got their hands on them, they knew the results were not just good. They were breathtaking. The plane was a completely different animal. The change was immediate and staggering. Here's the number that changed the war. At 30,000 feet, the new Merlin-powered Mustang was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the old Allison-powered version. Let that sink in. It wasn't a 10-mile-per-hour improvement. It was a 100-mile-per-hour leap. It could now climb like a rocket, leaving the best German fighters in its dust. It handled beautifully, and it was suddenly the fastest, most capable fighter in the sky, at the very altitudes where the bombers were being slaughtered. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a resurrection. By combining the most aerodynamically advanced airframe in the world with the best high-altitude engine in the world, they had, through a mix of American design and British engineering, created the perfect long-range thoroughbred. If you've ever worked on an old car or a tough project in the garage, you know how hard a job like an engine swap can be. Let us know in the comments if you've ever tackled a project that seemed this impossible. We truly enjoy reading those stories. The mediocre mud mover was dead. In its place stood the weapon that would finally allow the 8th Air Force to take the fight all the way to Berlin. So now they had a fighter that could perform at 30,000 feet. It was a miracle of transatlantic cooperation. It was fast, it could climb, and it handled like a sports car. But this solved only half of the crisis. The original problem, the one that was killing 600 men in a single day, wasn't just speed at altitude, it was range. How do you get this new hot rod with its powerful, thirsty Merlin engine from a rainy airfield in England to the skies over Berlin and back? That was a round trip of over 1,100 miles, an unheard-of distance for a single-engine fighter. This is where the genius of the original North American design, the part that existed even on the failed P-51A, paid off in a way no one could have anticipated. That original plane had been designed with a revolutionary new laminar flow wing. To put it simply, most aircraft wings at the time were curved on top, which created lift, but also created a great deal of turbulence, or drag. The Mustang's wing was different. It was thinner, and its thickest point was farther back. It was designed to have airflow over it, smoothly, like water gliding over polished stone. It was a low-drag masterpiece. Less drag means less fuel burned. It's that simple. Because of this, the Mustang was, by its very nature, a remarkably fuel-efficient aircraft. It sipped fuel where other fighters like the P-47 gulped it. But even that incredible efficiency wasn't enough. It could get the pilots farther into Germany, but not all the way to Berlin and back, with enough fuel left to fight. The engineers needed to find a place, to put more fuel, a lot more. The problem was, the wings were already packed. There was no more room. Their solution was bold, and frankly, it was a little dangerous. They decided if they couldn't put the fuel in the wings, they would put it in the fuselage. They installed a massive 85-gallon fuel tank right behind the pilot's seat. Pilots were wary of it, and for good reason. They were, in effect, sitting on a bomb. A direct hit on that tank from a German cannon shell would be catastrophic. And when it was full, it made the plane dangerously top-heavy and unstable. The pilots had to be careful, fly straight and level, and burn that rear tank's fuel first, before they even thought about getting into a dogfight. But this new tank, combined with two external drop tanks under the wings, gave them the one thing they needed more than anything: time. Now you put all the pieces together. You have the efficient, low-drag airframe. You have the powerful high-altitude Merlin engine. You have the standard fuel in the wings. You add the two 75-gallon drop tanks, and you add the new 85-gallon tank behind the pilot. Suddenly, the math that had seemed impossible worked. The new P-51B had a combat radius of over 850 miles. It could fly from England, escort the bombers, all the way to Berlin, drop its empty external tanks, fight for 30 minutes over the city, and then, flying on its internal fuel, escort the bombers all the way home. The gap of death was about to be closed. In late 1943, the very first of these new long-range P-51B Mustangs arrived in England. They were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, who called themselves the Pioneers. And at this exact critical moment, German intelligence made one of the greatest blunders of the war. They heard reports of a new Mustang, but their assessment was lazy and arrogant. They assumed it was just the same mediocre, Allison-powered plane they'd seen before, maybe with a few minor tweaks. Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring was famously dismissive of American fighter capabilities. They were confident in their Bf-109s and their Focke-Wulf 190s. They were, after all, the masters of the sky. They had no idea what was about to hit them. They had no idea that their gap of death was about to become the Mustang's new hunting ground. Now we come to the day it all changed. March 6, 1944. This was the moment. The entire strategic gamble, the millions of dollars, the thousands of aircraft, the lives of an entire generation of airmen would be proven right or wrong. The 8th Air Force launched its first massive daylight raid on the target that mattered most, Berlin, the heart of the Reich. Nearly 700 heavy bombers, a stream of aluminum, and American courage set out from the rainy fields of England on the ground across Germany. The sirens wailed. The younger, smarter, the veteran fighter wings of the Luftwaffe scrambled to their aircraft. These were the aces, men with dozens, some with hundreds of victories, fighting over their own soil. They were confident. They climbed to their preferred altitude, 30,000 foot, and they waited, just as they had done 100 times before. They waited for the gap of death. They watched as the American P-47s, the heavy jugs at the very edge of their range, dutifully wagged their wings, turned for home, and left the bombers. The feast was about to begin, but then something impossible happened. The P-47s left, but the skies were not empty. A new group of fighters, sleek and unfamiliar, remained. Not just a few, but hundreds of them. They were still climbing, still with the bombers. It was the 209 Mustangs of the 9th Air Force groups. For the German pilots, this was a moment of pure, cold psychological shock. Their safe zone was gone. The feast was canceled. The rules of the entire air war had just been rewritten in a single instant. This is where the story of aces like Franz Stigler, Adolf Galland, a man who had dismissed American long-range fighters, becomes so powerful. He and his fellow pilots now found themselves in a fight for their lives, deep inside their own territory. The plane they thought was a joke was now above them, faster than them, and it wasn't leaving. Their entire tactical playbook, built on years of experience attacking slow bombers, was suddenly worthless. How could they get to the bombers when these new fighters were swarming them? And the American strategy had changed, too. This was the real masterstroke. The new commander of the 8th Air Force was a man every American knew, General Jimmy Doolittle, the same hero who had led the daring raid on Tokyo in 1942. Doolittle was an aggressive, offense-minded leader. He looked at the old, timid orders, stick with the bombers at all costs, and he threw them out. He gave his fighter pilots a new, chillingly simple order: go find the enemy, hunt them down, and destroy them. He had unleashed the fighters. Their new job wasn't just to defend the bombers. It was to attack the Luftwaffe. So on that March day, when the German interceptors rose to meet the bombers, they weren't met by a passive wall of escorts. They were attacked. The P-51s, with their superior high-altitude performance, dove on the German formations before they could even get set for their attack runs. The hunters had, in every sense of the word, become the hunted. The day was a brutal running dogfight that stretched for hundreds of miles, from the border all the way to Berlin and back. The 8th Air Force paid a terrible price. 69 heavy bombers were lost. That's nearly 700 men. But for the first time, this agonizing loss rate was considered sustainable because the price paid by the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. They lost 64 fighters, and more importantly, they lost dozens of their irreplaceable veteran experts. The Luftwaffe could at that time still build new planes, but it could not replace those pilots. The myth of Berlin's invincibility was shattered. This single mission, on this single day, proved that the P-51 Mustang was the weapon that would finally and decisively win the war in the air. The P-51B was a revolution. It had saved the air war. But as any man who has worked with his hands knows, the first version of anything is never the final version. It wasn't perfect. Pilots were grateful to have it, but they had one major life-threatening complaint: that razorback fuselage. The pilot sat low in the cockpit, and the high metal spine behind his head created a massive, terrifying blind spot in a swirling, chaotic dogfight with enemies coming from every direction. What you can't see is precisely what kills you. A German fighter could slip in behind that blind spot, and the first time you'd know he was there was when his cannon shells started tearing your wings off. North American engineers listened, and their solution to this one problem would create the most iconic aircraft silhouette of the entire Second World War, the P-51D. They completely redesigned the rear fuselage, cutting that high spine down to almost nothing. Then they fitted a smooth, single-piece bubble canopy over the cockpit. The change was immediate and profound. The pilot now had a complete 360-degree view of the sky. He could check his six, his tail, simply by turning his head in the life-and-death business of aerial combat. This advantage alone cannot be overstated. It was the difference between hunting and being hunted. But they didn't just change the glass. They listened to the mechanics on the ground and the pilots in the air, and they upgraded the plane's teeth. The 450 caliber machine guns on the P-51B were effective, but their angled ammunition feed system was a constant source of frustration. In a hard, high-G turn, the kind you always pull in a dogfight, the ammo belts would kink and the guns would jam. Imagine lining up the perfect killing shot on a BF-109, squeezing the trigger and nothing. It was a fatal flaw. The P-51D fixed this. They added 2 more machine guns, for a total of 6 50-caliber Brownings. But more importantly, they completely redesigned the feed system to be simple, straight, and virtually jam-proof. This gave the Mustang a devastating, reliable punch. A 2-second burst from those 6 heavy machine guns would shred a German fighter, often causing it to disintegrate in mid-air. And there was one more piece of technology, something that seemed almost like magic at the time. It was the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight. Before this, the pilot had to be an expert marksman. He had to guess how much to lead a turning target, a skill they called Kentucky windage. It was all instinct and experience, but the K-14 was a simple analog computer. The pilot just dialed in the target's wingspan, say 33 foot for a BF-109, and used his rudder pedals to frame the plane's wings. The gun sight's gyroscope would then automatically calculate the correct lead. A little diamond would appear in his sight, showing him exactly where to aim to guarantee a hit. We're going deep on the engineering that made this plane a legend. This new gun sight made average pilots good, and it made good pilots absolutely lethal. So now, look at what they had created. The P-51D had the low-drag wing for efficiency. It had the powerful Merlin engine for high-altitude speed. It had the bubble canopy for 360-degree vision. It had 6 reliable, hard-hitting machine guns, and it had a computer to aim them. The transformation was complete. They had forged the perfect Predator. These P-51Ds began arriving in England in massive numbers during the spring of 1944, just as the Allies were in the final frantic stages of planning for the D-Day invasion. By the time the first boats hit the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, the P-51D had become the primary long-range escort fighter of the 8th Air Force. The disappointment from 1942 was now the most advanced, most feared, and most important fighter in the world. As the P-51D began arriving in massive numbers in the spring and summer of 1944, the final brutal chapter for the Luftwaffe began. The lead-up to the D-Day invasion on June 6th saw the air war intensify to a fever pitch. The Allies needed absolute control of the air over the beaches of Normandy, and the P-51 was the tool to get it. The German Air Force was now hopelessly on the defensive, but their problem was no longer just about facing a superior machine. It was a devastating mathematical problem of attrition. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging pilots, and not just any pilots. They were losing their expertise, their aces, the battle-hardened veterans who had fought since 1939. These were men with hundreds of victories, men who had survived the Battle of Britain, the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and the deserts of North Africa. They were the core of the Luftwaffe, its heart and soul. But they could not survive the endless daily waves of P-51Ds. For every German ace shot down, there were 10 more American pilots, fresh and well-trained, to take his place. For every P-51 lost, 5 more were rolling off the assembly lines in California and Texas. This is the part of the story that is often overlooked. The German pilot training program had completely collapsed under the pressure. By 1944, due to a crippling lack of fuel, training time, and experienced instructors, Germany was throwing rookies into the sky with barely 50 or 60 hours of total flight time. These young men were given a high-performance, unforgiving fighter like a BF-109 and told to go fight. Who were they fighting? They were fighting American pilots who had hundreds of hours of meticulous training before they ever even saw the coast of Europe. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. The green German pilots would take off terrified and would be pounced on by a swarm of Mustangs, often before they even saw them. Many were shot down on their very first mission, and General Doolittle's aggressive order to hunt had been taken to its logical, terrifying extreme. Mustang pilots, no longer even waited for the Luftwaffe to come up and fight. The new doctrine was clear. After the bombers had hit their target and were safely on their way home, the Mustang groups were free to hunt. They would drop down from 25,000 foot all the way down to treetop level and strafe the German airfields. This was a tactic that would have been suicidal just 6 months earlier, but now, with control of the sky, it was a devastatingly effective way to finish the job. Imagine the terror on the ground. A German airfield, men refueling a plane, and suddenly a dozen Mustangs appear over the trees at 400 miles per hour. Their 650 caliber guns tearing everything apart. They destroyed hundreds, then thousands of German planes on the ground before they could even take off. They shot up fuel trucks, a critical target, blew up locomotives, destroyed hangars, and strafed anything that moved. The Luftwaffe was left with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. If they flew, they died. If they stayed on the ground, they died. By the fall of 1944, following the successful D-Day landings and the breakout across France, the Luftwaffe, as a coherent fighting force, was finished. It was broken. It could still put planes in the air, but not in a way that could change the outcome of anything. It was no longer a question of if the Allies would win the air war, but only when. The P-51 Mustang, the plane, once dismissed as a failure, had done exactly what it was designed to do. As German general and fighter ace Adolf Galland famously said when he looked up from his airfield and saw the P-51 roaming freely over Berlin, "The war is lost." He knew in that moment that they could never again stop the bombers. The Mustang had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. The final accounting of the P-51, Mustang's contribution to the victory in Europe, is simply staggering. By the end of the war, Mustang pilots were credited with destroying approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. As if that weren't enough, they destroyed another 4,131 German aircraft on the ground during those relentless strafing attacks. Those numbers are almost too large to comprehend. They represent a devastating surgical removal of the Luftwaffe from the sky, and they were achieved in really just the final 18 months of the war. But did the P-51 Mustang win World War II by itself? Of course not. No single weapon system ever does. That great victory was earned by the infantrymen in the mud of the Hurtgen Forest, by the sailors on the cold, dark, convoy routes of the North Atlantic, and by the very bomber crews the Mustang was finally built to protect. The men in the B-17s and B-24s still had to fly through a wall of flak over the target, a terrifying ordeal that fighters could do little to prevent. The credit for victory belongs to all of them. But the Mustang's legacy is unique. It did something more strategically important than just shoot down planes. It enabled the entire strategic bombing campaign to finally succeed. It solved the impossible problem. It proved the experts, the slide rule engineers, and the defeatists wrong. It demonstrated that yes, you can build a fighter that is both a long-range marathon runner and a high-altitude heavyweight champion. It stands today as a permanent monument to American and British ingenuity, a testament to what happens when you refuse to accept that a problem can't be solved. When those German aces, men like Franz Stigler, first encountered the P-51, their assessment wasn't wrong. The Allison-powered plane, they saw, truly was a mediocre performer at high altitude. Their fatal mistake was a failure of imagination. They failed to imagine that the Allies, backed against a wall and losing a war of attrition, would be capable of such desperate, brilliant innovation. They failed to account for that one critical change, swapping a single engine that would transform a plow horse into a thoroughbred. That one change didn't just make a plane faster, it saved the lives of tens of thousands of American airmen. It allowed the bombers to reach their targets, to break the German war machine, and to shorten the war by many, many months. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the difference between catastrophic failure and total victory is finding that one critical piece that changes everything. The P-51 is a legend, but it was just one of many iconic aircraft from that era. Thank you for joining us for this piece of aviation history. We know your time is valuable, and we are truly grateful you chose to spend it with us.